Tonight's special segment, Proposition 2.5 on the line. The revolutionary property tax measure was approved by Bay State voters nearly a decade ago when the state's tax burden earned it the nickname Taxachusetts.
Now, with Beacon Hill threatening cuts in local aid, cities and towns are once again talking about cutting essential services. Eyewitness News reporter Andy Hiller says they're also talking about changing Prop 2.5.
Across the state, at school board meetings and at news conferences of elected officials, the words sound familiar.
Please don't take away any of today's teachers, because they are so valuable to us children. Please keep them all, so we can get what you got when you went to school.
Chelsea might as well fold up tent and ask Revere or Everett to adopt us. The loss of firefighters and police officers will be devastating.
I think everybody wants to stick to the 2.5 ceiling. The question is, how do we do that and at the same time make sure that our children are getting a quality education and we're getting the kind of good services, police, fire, and other things that we want in good, healthy communities.
Barbara Anderson, the woman credited with getting Proposition 2.5 passed, says she's heard it all before.
It's like deja vu all over again. The same people, same words, same attitude, same dislike of tax cuts and tax limitation.
In November 1980, Massachusetts voters overwhelmingly approved Proposition 2.5, limiting property tax revenues to 2.5% of fair market value and requiring cities above that figure to cut property taxes 15% a year to reach it. Local officials warned it would bring critical cuts.
I don't think we ought to kid anyone. There are going to be layoffs.
250 teachers. It means approximately 100 firemen, 100 policemen, 175 public works laborers.
Proposition 2.5 did reduce police, fire, and school personnel, but the cuts were not as severe as anticipated for several reasons. Boosted by high tech, the state's economy began booming. That meant more jobs and new tax revenue. New construction was up, and that generated new sources of property taxes. In fact, despite 2.5, statewide property tax collections began growing in 1983 and increased continuously through 1988, from under $3 billion to nearly $4 billion. At the same time, statewide school enrollment was decreasing, so teacher cuts were less painful. But the single most important factor in easing the impact of 2.5 on local governments was the state's increased local aid, which grew steadily from more than $1 billion in 1981 to just under $2.5 billion in 1988. This January, when Governor Dukakis proposed another increase in local aid, he tied it to his call for higher taxes. But the House rejected the governor's tax package and the increased local aid that would have gone with it, and the House Budget Chairman said that should not affect Proposition 2.5.
I don't think the two of them are related. Basically, we've level funded local aid here because it increased by 144% of all new monies collected by the state last year, 48% the year before. They have got to share a little bit in the downsizing of government the way the rest of the state agencies have done.
But the head of the Mass Municipal Association disagrees.
Yes, I do believe that the issue of 2.5 is back alive and on the line and due for some further discussion.
And Ray Flynn, who has assumed a role as spokesman for all the state's mayors, concurs.
Would you see then a possibility of an override of Proposition 2.5?
Well, you know, that's something that will be discussed, I'm sure, in the months ahead.
Proposition 2.5 permits local voters to override its limits, and since 1980, 83 communities have done just that. A similar number have rejected proposed overrides. 134 communities have also increased taxes to pay for specific projects, such as fire stations or new school buildings. More than 80% of the proposed capital projects overrides to 2.5 pass. Interestingly, tiny Northampton is the largest city that has ever attempted an override. None has ever been tried in major cities such as Boston, Worcester, or Springfield.
This coming Monday, March 27th, the town of Sudbury will go to the polls and vote to override Proposition 2.5, a general override for approximately $1.8 million.
Sudbury's chief executive thinks the town will override 2.5 next week for the second time in 12 months. At stake are 14 teaching jobs, 2 positions in the fire department, and assorted road improvement projects. Sudbury is a wealthy community with the average price of a home $300,000, and the cost of the proposed override an affordable $300 to each taxpayer. Sudbury proves the point that 2.5 has not affected all cities and towns equally.
How has 2.5 worked here?
The impact of 2.5 has been small.
But Sudbury taxpayers we talked to in a shopping mall all said they still want the protections of 2.5.
Because it helps to keep the taxes down in the towns for the elderly. You take the 2.5 off and the taxes are going to go way up.
I think Proposition 2.5 is great because it saves me money.
I don't want to change. I like it the way it is.
And even in Chelsea, one of the state's poorest cities, most people who know about 2.5 don't want it changed.
I think they should stay with it. I think they should keep spending down and not increase the income for the state or the cities.
I'm always for that. I was for that before Barbara Anderson.
How come?
Because it's common sense.
And what those people say is what makes Barbara Anderson so confident.
Do you feel as if right now Proposition 2.5 is on the line?
I think there are a lot of politicians and special interest groups in the state that would like it to be on the line, but I think it's pretty well protected by the fact that the decision is with the same voters who elect most of the people up here in Beacon Hill.
What's making people even talk about changing Proposition 2.5 is the new fiscal reality in Massachusetts. After years of growth, the state's economy is slowing down. That's squeezing everyone, Beacon Hill, city halls, and taxpayers, with a choice no one likes to make, the choice between higher taxes or fewer programs. As always, the wealthy will be most insulated from any cutbacks in services the future may bring, and the poor will be most vulnerable. But the new reality will also squeeze a new group, the middle class, homeowners, whose property represents the only source of additional revenue cities and towns can touch. And Liz, that means 2.5.
Okay, Andy. Good. So people will be feeling the squeeze who haven't felt it before.
That's what I believe, yes. That's what's happening at Beacon Hill. That's what's happening in cities.
Okay, thank you. Good report.
This is Eyewitness News Conference. From our studios in Boston, here's Andy Hiller.
Good morning and happy Easter. Once again, there is a bullseye around Proposition 2.5. As the state's financial situation has grown progressively worse, various officials and groups have expressed frustration with the tax limiting measure approved by state voters in 1980, and several changes and modifications to 2.5 have been proposed. The latest came last week from Governor Dukakis, who filed a bill with the legislature that would give cities and towns a chance to raise revenues without first getting voter approval by linking the 2.5 limit with the rate of inflation. That proposal comes as the group that authored 2.5, Citizens for Limited Taxation, prepares to ask state voters to cut state taxes and fees by about $1 billion. Something has to give. The state cannot continue to spend more than it collects. But what will give? This morning we'll talk to Barbara Anderson about that. Anderson is the executive director of Citizens for Limited Taxation, who arguably has had as much impact on the budget debate as anyone. On our panel this morning, Bruce Mole, State House Bureau Chief for the Boston Globe, and Shelby Scott, who covers Beacon Hill for Eyewitness News. First question, your reaction to the governor's proposal.
Well, you'll excuse me if I don't overreact to this, but the governor has been trying over the years to get rid of 2.5. He now has another proposal. I don't think the legislature is going to start a fight with the taxpayers and voters on Prop 2.5. I just don't think his proposal is going anywhere.
Why do you think he did it then? Is it a tactic to move the voter mood? Is it aimed at putting pressure, for example, by getting local officials to call their representatives? Do you think he has something strategic in mind?
I don't think he has anything in mind, period.
Barbara, specifically on the proposal, it comes from the Hamill Commission. It's not just the governor's idea. It links the property tax growth to the rate of inflation that the cities and towns have to pay for goods and services. Isn't that a fair way to do things?
Yeah, it would be great when inflation hits, say, 11 or 12% as it did during Jimmy Carter's years. It isn't just his proposal. It's the proposal of Hamill from the Shawmut Bank. The banks are in trouble. The Shawmut Bank was running in the red last quarter. I'm sure this is the first person I'd go to ask for a suggestion on how to run the state. The banks need someplace that will borrow, and the business community is in trouble. So now you can change 2.5, because part of the proposal is not just to allow taxes to go up at the rate of inflation. It's to allow debt exclusions to be outside of 2.5 without a vote of the people. So now the cities and towns will be encouraged to borrow more. I'm sure that will suit the Shawmut Bank, which up until a year or so ago was doing about 50% of the municipal business.
You're claiming an ulterior motive then on the part of Mr. Hamill.
Absolutely. The banks in general will benefit from leaving debt exclusions outside of Prop 2.5 and not having to convince the voters that incurring more debt for their community is a good idea. As for increasing it for the rate of inflation, or even for that matter, a debt exclusion, the voters can do that. They simply have to ask. Roughly half the time a voter override passes, so the people are open to suggestion. But in this case, the governor is saying the people should not be allowed to make that decision. He will make it for it, he and the downtown banking community.
What about the auto excise portion of that, which is separate from 2.5 but was changed along with when 2.5 was passed?
Yeah, when 2.5 was passed, we cut the auto excise tax. They've been trying to find some way to tax cars at their full and fair market value ever since. They do such a great job analyzing the full and fair market value of our homes. And now they want to chase our cars around to figure out the full and fair market value. This will hit the auto industry again, which is, of course, where the sales tax revenue decline has come in. So this is guaranteed to make sure that the sales tax revenues in the state continue to decline. Brilliant idea, Michael. I don't know why we didn't think of it first.
Barbara, but don't cities and towns need some flexibility in raising revenues? They can't look to the state, it seems, to get more revenues in the future. And your own proposal is proposing to cut state tax revenues in the future. So where do cities and towns go?
Well, in the first place, they can go to the voters. That's what the Prop 2.5 override provision is there for unusual situations. Certainly, I think you might consider the state deficit situation unusual. At least I would hope so. So that's what the override provision is there for, is a safety net for the cities and towns.
So what should a community so what you're saying that if the voters disapprove of raising taxes above 2.5% in their community, they just have to cut until they meet that requirement?
Well, they have to do whatever the voters in their community want. These voters are the ones best qualified to know what their community is like. If in fact possibly there was so much local aid during the 80s that maybe these communities were living a little high themselves and weren't restraining themselves. Maybe some communities need to do that. Other communities weren't getting perhaps their fair share of local aid. Others have stabilization funds that they had sense enough to set aside. Others do not. Only the voters in a community can really determine whether their town is well managed or poor or what the situation is, and only they know if they can afford higher property taxes, especially with layoffs in the private sector, which means you wouldn't have any money to pay your higher property taxes with.
You know, the fundamental assumption of everything you say, and sometimes, I really do think you have an active mind, and I really find myself saying, gee, what if she's right?
Takes one to know one, Andy.
I don't see the conspiracy theory, though, between the banks and Beacon Hill, but it is interesting. The fundamental assumption is let the voters decide. If you ask the voters, that will be fine. The voters can somehow decide that whether their town is well run. But
better than I can.
Right, and presumably better than Beacon Hill can. But the problem is human beings are selfish. I mean, that's basically human beings are selfish. And you take an example of schools.
Is this going to be a philosophical discussion?
It's a half-hour show, but it's not endless. So it'll be
well, what does selfish mean? I mean, selfish means one's self-interest.
One's self-interest.
Which can be long-term as well as short-term.
Yes, but by self-interest, let's put it in a local context. I'm an older person. I don't have people in schools. I've paid my way for schools. I'm not interested any longer in supporting schools. Whatever they've done for the community, they're not going to do for me. Consequently, I don't want to override 2.5 to raise money for schools because, after all, I'm not going to be getting anything for it.
That's an unfair assumption. First of all, some of the most active people I've seen in promoting overrides have been senior citizens.
Go ahead.
There's no reason to assume that senior citizens wouldn't see a larger picture and see the benefit to society to having an educated population. Never mind the selfish motive that they want that educated population working to support them in their old age with Social Security. So that's an inaccurate assumption and unfair to senior citizens and their ability to see the big picture.
Let me change it a little bit then.
Why don't you do that? You went through real well with that one, Andy.
In an effort to broaden it. I don't only mean older people who've had kids already go through schools. I mean single people. I mean younger people who don't have kids. There are a lot of people who look at schools as something that doesn't necessarily impact them. But schools to me is just one example of services, libraries. There may be people that don't want libraries. How do you get people to contribute to the collective good if that is what the society is supposed to be all about?
How have they done it in roughly half the time the overrides and debt exclusions have passed? If what you were saying is true, you would never see voluntary tax increases. You would never see a majority of voters voting to increase their property taxes And in fact, you see it all the time.
But look at the backdrop of what we have now. We have escalating taxes. We are hit with news that there's a deficit of over $2 billion. There is some genuine...
Keep your numbers in perspective here. I mean, even earlier you said $1 billion was what our petition would cost. Let's talk about fiscal year, the fiscal year at a time. You're not talking about $2 billion for fiscal 90 or $2 billion for fiscal 91.
When I say $2 billion, I'm talking about
an accumulated deficit. If we go up to the year 2040, you're hitting, real money. So let's define what period of time we're talking about with our deficit numbers.
Which is also assuming no changes, for example, in Medicaid, which is $500 million of Richie Volk's
You're assuming that they don't do a thing to downsize government between now and next year, yes.
But the basic question is, since the cost of government is going up, and everyone sees that, and since there is internationally less a feeling here that we control our own destiny because there are more things out of our control, and as we have this enlightened self-interest, long-term and short-term, and more people are interested in what they need to do for their families and themselves, how do you make people see the bigger picture, the obligation to society?
I think people see the bigger picture, which is that if we pay another $1 billion in taxes this year, setting aside 2.5 now, which would be even more, the package they're looking at is $1 billion, and they don't downsize government, and government continues to expand, and we don't address the waste and mismanagement, then next year you're looking long-term at another $1 billion increase. Then the year after that, you're looking at even more of $1 billion plus because you still have this expansion of government, and people looking at their long-term best interest figure. I can't afford to stay here, and if I don't stay here, and other productive citizens don't stay here, and we can't make it, and the private sector starts to deteriorate even further, who is going to provide those essential services as part of that social ideal? Where's the money going to come from if our economy goes down the tube because they can't control their spending?
And what makes you think that people in every community are somehow expert enough in the operations of their municipal government that they can go and make a decision when they're faced with either paying more taxes or keeping them where they are, that they can judge a municipality to be sufficiently well run that they say, yes, I vote to give them more money, when there is such a crescendo of anecdotal evidence that every government has some waste?
Andy, and going back to my original point here, which is that if that were true, what you're saying, if people were not capable of doing that, if they just looked at the bottom line of their own budget, you would never see overrides passing, and you see them passing all the time. People carefully weigh. My community's had overrides. One year we had 8 questions on the ballot, 4 passed, 4 failed. This year, 2 passed. Another one this summer may pass or fail. But the people in my community certainly sit down and weigh very carefully the importance of these things, the priorities, and also, I suppose, how much they can afford.
I'm going to try one last time.
If my town can do it, other communities
I'm going to try one last
well.
time. Take military service.
Keep trying, Andy. Sooner or later we'll...
Sooner
or later we'll even let them...
In fact, sooner. Right after this.
Yes.
Military service. A person could go into military service if they believed that the government was fighting just wars. If they didn't, they wouldn't go in. Very few people would go in.
And we wouldn't have had Vietnam. What an excellent suggestion that was. If we only did just wars and only volunteers would go, Vietnam wouldn't have happened. Would that have been a tragedy, looking back on it now?
And World War II?
World War II, people were lining up to volunteer for World War II right after Japan attacked us. That's a good example, and I'm absolutely right.
My last one before, and I love when somebody makes a judgment and then also passes judgment on the accuracy of the judgment. Let's go to Shelby.
You're being awfully secure, Andy.
You're trying to get off the hook, Andy. You've suggested some sort of bond sale to get the state out of the red ink. How would that work? I mean, can you really believe that people buy tax-free bonds now, but they save them, they invest? Can you really see people buying them and giving them back to the state? I just can't believe that would happen.
Well, this is a 2-tier plan here, Shelby. We recognize that they've got a problem and it's too late. They have deliberately waited until it's too late to do anything about this year's deficit except bond it or raise taxes, and even then you have to bond it. So we thought if you're going to bond it, instead of selling to the Japanese or whatever you do with your bonds if the bond market isn't responding, instead of giving it to people who already know how to invest in tax-exempt bonds, let people like me who wouldn't know where to begin
but
buy a
you can go
tax-exempt
down and buy
bond.
mini bonds now. The treasurer offers them all the time.
You probably can. I personally don't know how to do it. You may know how to do it because
you walk down to one Ashburton place and plunk down your money and they give you a bond.
I don't want to go to one Ashburton place. I want to go to my bank in my town. No, I'm talking about regular people. And I don't do investment. I wouldn't know a capital gain if I found it in my salad, so I don't do that. I'm saying if I go to my bank, and instead of putting the money into my savings account, which is a nice, easy way to do it, I could simply buy a bond, the same as a U.S. savings bond, at, say, 7%. And then I guess your yield, since it's tax-exempt, is 9.25%, 9.5%, 10%, depending upon how it works out.
And what pays for
3
these
years
bonds?
or 5 years?
What supports these bonds? A tax increase.
No. The people buy the bonds. The money is now there to deal with this year's deficit, or at least part of the deficit. Who knows how many people would buy it? You'd have to promote it. And the Boston Business Journal, there was an article there this last weekend that said that the Ad Club of Boston could take this on as a project, and you could actually get up to $1 billion worth of bonds sold, the way you promote the lottery.
I think it would be very easy to sell the bonds because people buy tax-frees a lot.
Sure.
But part of your plan is for those people then to turn around and donate the money back to the state.
I'm not donating it back to the state.
Your
I'm
18%
saying that
formula.
those people who want to raise my taxes to pay for their mismanagement, all of the Tax Equity Alliance, for instance, our chief opponent made up of the public employee unions, the League of Women Voters, those people could go out, they could buy these tax-exempt bonds, and they could turn them over to the state, and we would like to see legislation that would give them a tax deduction for a charitable contribution the way they will automatically get it from the federal government. That way they can put their money where their compassion is instead of trying to look compassionate at the expense of other people who can't afford to do this and also don't want to pour money more into a system that isn't responding and isn't setting priorities. I think it's a great idea.
Are you really serious about it? I just can't picture
serious.
people doing that.
I can't either, Shelby. I always see them up on Beacon Hill saying we've got to raise taxes, we're compassionate, we care about the needy and the poor. And I do wonder, too, what would happen if we gave them an opportunity to put their money where their mouths are, to take money themselves, to buy a bond and put it into these human services they think are so important, instead of taking what the rest of us would get, which would be an investment in a couple of years, a return on our money.
Don't you think those human services are important, too?
Yes, I do, to the point where I can understand, because I can stand back from it, and see what's going to happen to human services in this state if they don't start to downsize government to make up for the rapid expansion during the boom years, and every year they need $1 billion tax increase, and they hit the capital gains tax and drive the investors out, and they hit the income tax and drive productive people out or make us stop doing the extra work we do for the extra income. They raise the tax on automobiles so people stop buying automobiles. Then where does the money come from for the human services? The productive sector of the economy that they're attacking now is a sector that provides all the revenue for all state services. You take care of that sector, or you're in serious trouble. And when you have a recession, the people who get hurt are inevitably people at the bottom.
Here in the private sector, we have to raise some revenues, too, so we'll take a break and then we'll be back. We're back with Barbara Anderson. Let me ask you a quick question. We'll get a quick answer. Do you agree with Speaker Kavarian that there would be a tax increase passed quickly if Governor Dukakis resigned?
I think that it would certainly help them get a tax increase through if the governor resigned, yes.
Barbara, you said earlier that you want to always let the voters decide on various issues. 4 years ago, in 1986, they decided on a tax cap that put a lid on the way state revenues could grow. And it said that they could only grow in terms of a percentage increase with wages and salaries. Mm-hmm. You sold that tax cap as a reasonable limit on growth in tax revenues. Now today we're about $1.2 billion below that cap.
Proves how reasonable it was, doesn't it?
So it appears to be reasonable to be $1.2 billion higher. The voters said that was a reasonable limit. Why do you want to cut revenues further with the petition you're currently pushing and prevent any increase right now?
Well, the limit is a ceiling beyond which they cannot go, even with a vote of the legislature now for a tax increase, unless they repeal the limit. It's like the Prop 2.5 limit. The ceiling of 2.5% of fair market value is up there. Even with overrides, you can't go over that. So the ceiling in the tax cap is still sitting up there. If they pass a $1 billion tax increase this year, they'll be under the limit. If they go for the $2 billion tax increase, and they still have time to go in this year, then of course they'd hit that limit. They wouldn't be able to go beyond it.
So the $1 billion tax increase, it fits within the reasonable limit.
Oh, sure, and if they can convince the voters in the state to agree to encourage their legislators to allow a $1 billion tax increase, then the tax cap will not be violated, but I think they're going to have trouble making a case for another $1 billion after the tax increases we've had the last few years.
But how can you argue that a tax cap that is reasonable 4 years ago is now just an upper limit, and you can't raise your taxes to that limit?
It was a reasonable upper limit. They can raise the taxes to the limit. They just have to vote to do it, and the population has to agree with it. I don't think people are willing to give another $1 billion to a system that just has been chosen, the 48th best managed in the country, which is second from the bottom in poor management.
But isn't what Bruce is really getting at is why do you want to roll them back even to what, 1980, I'm lost in fiscal years here, but to a couple years ago back? I mean, that's what your petition would do.
Well, no, actually what the petition does is takes the income tax increase from last year,
right,
which again they chose to do instead of the downsizing, which would have been much easier last year. They raised our taxes to pay for Medicaid bills they hadn't bothered to pay during the economic miracle. This was not a legitimate way to do things, but they did it. We said, fine, you can keep the money until you pay off the Medicaid bonds and the nursing homes, and then you're going to pay the money back to us, treat it as an interest-free loan, and we're going to roll it back to where or we're going to actually cut the income tax for the same period of time in the future to get the money back for. So it's not strictly a rollback, but it does take money back from the Treasury.
You said you agree that there should be some human services. With the way Medicaid's going up, Chairman Richard Volk of House Ways and Means says that's going to be more than half the budget. You know, things like that are going to grow. Our population's getting older. Our birth rate's very low. So those kind of costs, which are, I guess you would agree, are not waste, are going to continue going up. Yet you want to pull money back. How can those things go on? But not billions and billions of dollars.
Well, what else are you going to do? I mean, Chairman Volk is absolutely right. You're going to need, if they don't do something about Medicaid, an extra $500 or $600 million a year, half of which is reimbursable, of course. If you're going to have that kind of uncontrollable cost, and I'm not convinced it's that uncontrollable, but if you are going to have that, then you can no longer afford the luxury of the kind of mismanagement and waste we've had. They have to start addressing that because there's no way you can have a $600 million or $1 billion tax increase every single year. So his assumption is correct. But the cure, which is let's raise taxes another $1 billion this year, and then forget about all this through the fall while we can campaign for re-election, and then hit us with another $1 billion next year, that's not a solution, Shelby.
Okay, let's take a look at Barbara's world. CLT petition passes. What's different in Massachusetts a year from now than right now? What services don't we have? I presume that some entitlement programs that we have now will have to be reduced. What else is different? What services aren't there? Or do you actually believe that we suddenly have a cadre of professional politicians and state employees who go to work, perform their tasks, and give the same level of services as right now, but do it for billions of dollars less?
I think, frankly, first of all, you have to look at the petition as what's going to make it, what it's going to do before it gets on the ballot. If the fear of the petition keeps them from raising that $1 billion tax increase, then of course they don't have to do that rollback next year, because the taxes will disappear at the end of this year.
You could live with a defeat of this petition.
Pardon?
You could live with a defeat. We're sitting close together, so I thought you'd be able to hear me. You could live with a defeat.
If you enunciate it more clearly, Andy.
Well, okay. You could live, I don't do sign language. You could live with a defeat of this petition.
And, well, I'd have to, wouldn't I? I don't understand what the...
Well, you might go back the next day and say, we're putting it on the ballot again. In other words, when you just say right now, if they see it as a threat, you've said before, it is a tool.
Well, you have to weigh the dollar amount. If our petitions can prevent a $1 billion tax increase this year, don't forget, even if our petition passes, people still have to pay that increase all this year. That Prop 2.5 bill will be repealed by our petition. If they pass that 2.5 change, then our petition almost certainly will win. So the fear of our petition may keep them from attacking 2.5. So we'll save enough, because you still have to pay the property taxes in October until we got to repeal them, could save the taxpayers enough just by keeping them from raising taxes this summer or this spring.
You do believe there's going to be a tax increase, though?
I don't know. The thing that has surprised me pleasantly is that the House has held out as long as it has, that the rank-and-file House members have not given in yet and have not given in the tax increase. I think it's possible that they'll stick to their pledge that unless they see another major spending cut package, they're not going to vote for a tax increase. We still have a chance with that.
You know, time and time again, I've watched you testify at hearings, and they'll say, well, then, Barbara, what should we do? Where can we cut? And you've never come up with anything saying, hey, that's not my business. But as a citizen of the state, isn't it your business, if you know where they could cut, to tell them, suggest a cut anyway?
Yeah, but I don't know where that assumption comes from. We've never suggested cuts. We sent up a series of cuts to Chairman Volk last year. We give them to the people who can do something about it. I brought some with me if you want me to read today. I brought my whole binder here on all the suggested...
We have about 3 minutes left.
Gee, I didn't think you would, Andy, but every time, you know, I offer to read my binder. No one ever has time. They don't have time at the hearings either.
All the pages have writing on them?
The thing I think that the Globe actually had the best idea. And the Globe was that you take a list of things that are essential that you have to do, and then a list of things that are not so essential, and you start trading off. My favorite way to do this is, say, take the Lieutenant Governor's office. $400,000 you spend on the Lieutenant Governor's office. What does the Lieutenant Governor's office do? Nothing. It helps her run for, or him, whoever it is, run for the next office. That $400,000 will completely restore the Talking Books program for the blind. Just for example...
Abolish the Lieutenant Governor's office. You'd like to do that?
That's definitely what I would do. If the choice were a Talking Books program for the blind...
Keep going.
Or the Lieutenant...
I like that one. Keep going.
$3 million is what they need for the Turning 22 program. If you got rid of the Council on the Arts, that is $5 million. You'd have $2 million left over. So you could do this trade-off back and forth until you finally came to this 0 point where you ran out of revenue, and then you just stopped with the non-essentials. But I'll bet you would have funded at that point everything that is essential.
So your belief is that the people who have fought these cuts are really fighting cuts that could be made, and that even though we've watched months of nothing happen on Beacon Hill, No one could come through with a list like this and say, cut here, cut here, cut
Oh,
here.
I've seen the list. Chester Atkins had a great list, some of which has been done. And people should understand some of these suggestions that never could be done without a fiscal crisis are being done. Greg Sullivan and his group had another list. Chet Atkins had a great idea last week, I heard, at a speech he gave on requiring AFDC parents to send their kids to school or they don't get the check. This is a very dramatic proposal, but it's being taken seriously just because they now have to get serious about some of this. I think this is a great opportunity, which you do have in a fiscal crisis environment, to actually get something done and get the state back on track. And I don't see how we can afford to pass up this opportunity, and our petition gives them an incentive to start to do some of these things.
Why is your petition, in the polls right now at least, apparently either trailing Team's petition or neck and neck, if people are so behind that petition?
I'm not sure they are. I'm just saying I'm behind it. I have no idea what the mood of the public will be. The one thing I'm afraid of and that I wouldn't understand is if the public, still angry about the taxes and the mismanagement, is willing to give in, to just roll over. I don't understand this, give in. I can understand being nice and re-electing Mike Dukakis in '82 because he said he was sorry, and besides that, he and Bellotti made Eddie King look like a crook. I can see making a mistake like that. But I can't relate to anybody who would look at this, recognize how bad things are, and say, oh, well, I give up. What's the use? Give him another $1 billion. I'm hoping that won't be the mood in November.
Last question. Who's the next governor?
Oh, gee, I don't know. Somebody besides Michael Dukakis, thank God.
Back in a moment with the final word.